Hello, everyone, and welcome to week four, exploring the Cold War. I hope you enjoyed your discussion of the early Cold War era and especially the Oppenheimer movie and the Manhattan Project. As you can tell, it's something I'm very interested in and passionate about, and really enjoyed reading all of your discussions on this. So I wanted to remind all of you that you do have two film reviews that are due before the end of the year. This time is kind of a really great time to watch some films that coincide with this. Obviously, being a nuke nerd, I've got a lot of nuclear films on here. So some that I would kind of recommend that would go along with last week's or this week's theme that I think would be really interesting. One of my favorites of all time, it's a documentary on a history of US nuclear accidents, Command and Control. Truly the most mind-blowing film you've ever seen. Really well done. If you want a really kind of bizarre documentary on US nuclear history, Atomic Cafe is super fascinating and interesting and draws on a lot of cool archival footage. The Day After is a really kind of prominent film of a nuclear attack in Lawrence, Kansas in 1983. It was so prominent that Reagan actually wrote in his diary that this led him into strategic arms talks with the Soviets. So had a huge kind of impact both publicly and afterwards. Dr. Strangelove, I think, is perfect for this week since you're reading The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. This 1964 Stanley Kubrick film is a classic dark comedy about nuclear deterrence. We're also studying the Vietnam War this week, so Hearts and Minds is an essential kind of Vietnam War documentary that was published in 1974. So it's an anti-war Vietnam War documentary, but really fascinating footage as well. So highly recommend you get your one pager done this week and can coincide with some of that. Again, it's not due until the end of the term, but we don't want things to sneak up on us. So as you'll see this week, we're studying the Cold War. And again, we can't do it justice. Doing all the early nuclear era and Vietnam War in 1 week is criminal, but here we are. Got another podcast from A Most Terrible Weapon on the dilemmas of deterrence. Scott Sagan's fantastic work on Single Integrated Operations Plan 62, so the U.S. nuclear war planning documents. Daniel Ellsberg's Doomsday Machine. There's a lot of really good stuff in the Cold War intelligence activities. If you want to kind of understand that a bit more, just kind of browse through that. And then for your lecture this week, I'm going to give you a bit of a preview here today. But instead of making you kind of read some more, doing like another 50-minute lecture like I did last time, I'm going to have you listen to a couple podcasts. One is with me and one is with Dr. Reed Pauly. This is from the Risk Calculus at University of California, Berkeley, where both of us talk about wargaming in the early Cold War period. So how we thought about kind of nuclear war. So a really fun way and accessible way to kind of look at that without having to do more reading or listen to me talk for 45 minutes. Because you do have a book talk by Gregory Daddis, as well as some very short Vietnam 67 New York Times pieces as well, leading into our discussion and our quiz. So I want to go ahead and give you just kind of a brief overview lecture real quick today, and then I'll let you get into the fun podcasts and readings. So, as was said, this is the Cold War, from early nuclear warfare to the Vietnam War. So the NSA archive actually has a lot of really cool archival footage that they have. So I highly recommend you explore it.
250 Your climb out instructions, left turn, climb on course, cleared for takeoff. Roger, take 1-1. Clear, is clear.
So just really cool archival footage from Strategic Air Command, their kind of training videos, B-52 operations, you name it, they have it in the National Security Archive. So especially if you're a nerd like me, really, really cool stuff to explore. As well, in the National Security Archive, they have a great companion to Scott Sagan's article. So the Single Integrated Operations Plan, or SIOP 62, the origins of overkill and nuclear war planning. So Sagan starts out with a really, really fascinating argument that, prior to the early 1960s, we were really planning on engaging in and winning a nuclear war. When we think about nuclear deterrence today, we look at it, that it's the idea that it's kept the world stable and avoided great power wars since the creation of atomic weapons. But what we miss is that kind of early Cold War period where we genuinely thought we could fight and win nuclear wars. And not only that, as Sagan talks about in the beginning of his article on the Single Integrated Operations Plan, each branch of the US military had their own war plan, and it wasn't one integrated plan until here. So check out the National Security Archive in addition to reading Sagan's article on this. I do want to highlight you're reading from a couple chapters from Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. So you may not realize that Daniel Ellsberg is the same Dan Ellsberg that leaked the Pentagon Papers in the Vietnam War. What's interesting about that is that he worked at the Rand Corporation, was a very prominent deterrence theorist. And as you'll see in the podcast this week, I did a lot of archival research at the Rand Corporation. And he actually stole a lot of nuclear war planning documents as well, because he viewed it just as critical and as essential as the Vietnam War papers. What's interesting, though, is that at the time, he obviously viewed the Vietnam War as much more pressing, thousands and thousands of US soldiers and individuals in Southeast Asia kind of dying daily, that was a real pressing issue. While he stole these documents, he focused on the Vietnam War documents and getting those out first. He hid these at his brother's junkyard, and they got washed away in a flood. And so as he got later on in life, he decided that he needed to write this book from declassified documents as well as his memory of events before he passed away a few years back. So really fascinating story. He's one of those whistleblowers that was very prepared to go to jail. And the only reason he got off, interestingly enough, is that Richard Nixon broke into his psychiatrist's office to try and steal his psychiatric evaluations to get dirt on him. Classic tricky dick move. And as a result, the judge threw out the case against him. So we don't actually know how it would have been ruled because Nixon didn't give us the chance. So in this chapter, he talks a little bit about the idea of the doomsday machine, or something that could automatically trigger nuclear war. And specifically, he focuses on the perimeter system. So, of course, that goes along perfectly well with Stanley Kubrick's 1964 film, Dr. Strangelove. And it's a really, really good film. Highly recommend you watch it if you want to do that for your 1 week review. It goes really well with this week's themes, especially with Dan Ellsberg's piece on the dead hand, or the perimeter system. So I do want to say that for this week's lectures, you are going to be given 2 podcasts by the Risk Calculus, based on some work that I did at the Rand Corporation on their early nuclear wargaming, as well as Reed Pauly, who did a bunch of archival work at MIT that led to his really fantastic article, Would Leaders Press the Button? War Games and Sources of Nuclear Restraint. So both he and I wanted to look at the early Cold War period, since thankfully we have no empirical evidence of what would happen in a nuclear exchange between 2 superpowers like the US and Soviet Union. So what I did is I wanted to look at the 1950s and how did they think about the future of war, and they used wargaming and simulation to kind of explore that. So it's a really fascinating tale of 2 different divisions within the Rand Corporation, which is essentially like an early Air Force think tank. And with that, you had the mathematicians and economists on one hand and the social scientists on the other. The mathematicians were trying to solve the dilemmas of nuclear deterrence with a mathematical formula, and the social scientists were trying to gain an understanding from the process of wargaming, try to understand how humans make decisions under pressure. And then as a result of those games, they kind of proliferated and migrated to MIT, led by Lincoln Bloomfield and some other RAND Corporation individuals, where they had quite a few State Department and military officials and high-level officials play kind of very realistic nuclear war games. And Reed kind of helps you explore in that podcast some sources of restraint. So why don't leaders press the button? And in mine, I talk about the kind of moral implications of pressing the button and how even in a war game simulated environment, people who advocated very staunch aggressive policies in their writings tended to behave with much more caution when faced with the burden of decision making. So really fascinating study into history, psychology, and nuclear crisis simulation. Next, you're going to have a nice book talk by Gregory Daddis. If you had time to read the whole book, I would highly recommend it. So Greg Daddis is a really fascinating individual. I taught with him when I was at Chapman University a number of years back. A lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army and the preeminent historian of Cold War, especially Vietnam, wrote 5 or 6 books on the Vietnam War from Westmoreland, a great study of him and his war in Vietnam. But this one, Pulp Vietnam, is really, really fascinating. The idea of Cold War adventure magazines for men and the way in which gender and war are kind of always intertwined. So ideas of masculinity, of femininity, and how that played out in the Pulp series. As you can see, it's got really, really interesting graphics, very disturbing in a lot of ways as well. So just be forewarned there, but really great book talk by one of the most amazing scholars on the topic, the best Vietnam War historian in my eyes, at least. With that, you're going to be given a number of readings from Vietnam 67. I wanted to highlight a couple things. You're going to be talking about the illegal bombing of Cambodia by Nixon and Kissinger, but you can kind of debate the legality versus the morality versus proportionality. But this fantastic Anthony Bourdain quote, "Once you've been to Cambodia, you'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands." Thankfully, at 100 years old, Kissinger has just recently died, so no one has the opportunity to do that. This is just an outline of the U.S. bombing campaign in Cambodia, Operation Menu during the war. Operation Barrel Roll was Laos, and this is kind of, again, a map of this. From 1964 to 1973, the U.S. dropped more than 2.5 million tons of ordnance on Laos during 580,000 bombing sorties, so equal to a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years, right? So just astronomical amounts of air power and bombing campaigns. And one of the big issues here was that a lot of these were cluster munitions, so we had a lot of unexploded ordnances that still to this day, or little bomblets, they're trying to clean up, so much so that you have children's textbooks in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam to basically say, like, when you see these little things, don't pick them up, because many, many individuals have lost limbs or lives because of that still to this day. So just something to kind of keep in mind as you're reading through all of these articles. And then just wanted to highlight one of them as well. The kind of Lyndon B. Johnson Optimism Campaign is a very fascinating article in this. And you don't get to read the novels of Viet Thanh Nguyen, but if you're interested in the Vietnam War, he is the preeminent novelist when it comes to understanding war. And this is one of the phrases from his novel that really sticks with me. All wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. And I think that's especially true in the Vietnam War, both in the US and in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. So really, really understanding the war from a wide variety of perspectives, I think, is crucial here. So I hope you enjoy this week's readings, podcasts, and lectures. And I look forward to hearing all of your discussions on this. I think it's going to be a really, really fascinating time.